says a lot of good things about you all for coming and a lot of good things about Carter too. So thank you for spending some time with us here in the afternoon before break. It's my pleasure to serve as Carter Johnson's thesis advisor and to introduce him here today. I've known Carter since his very first semester at VMI. He was the only rat in my Ways of Reading course that fall. But he was undaunted by this, and he quickly became a leader in class discussion. His contributions were confident, insightful, and well considered. His essays showed rare academic prowess. I was very glad that he was an English major from the get-go. Carter's taken 3 classes with me since then, so I've had a chance to witness his academic development over the years, and it's been very impressive. He's excelled in the classroom at VMI, and he's become a leader on the ethics debate team and on the editorial staff of the cadet literary journal, Cadence. He's published poems in literary journals and presented his research at academic conferences. In just a few weeks, he's going to be presenting some of this research at International Steinbeck Conference. When he asked me to advise his Institute Honors thesis, I agreed enthusiastically. Carter is intellectually curious and an independent thinker, so I'm not surprised that he already had an idea for it. He wanted to write about John Steinbeck's East of Eden, a book he had read on his own during his first year at VMI. Now, I think Carter's going to say some more about this in a minute, but that in and of itself was no small feat. East of Eden is a really, really long book, and it's impressive that he found the time to read it during his 4th class year. But that became sort of kind of an intellectual hobby for Carter, one that tells a lot about him, I think. He likes to read massive books on top of his coursework and extracurricular activities. That might sound a little masochistic, but I think he enjoys it. Last year it was James Joyce's notoriously difficult Ulysses, and I was impressed as that he'd bring it to his class with him and I'd see that bookmark climb up that really hard book over the course of the semester. This year it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's notoriously long Gulag Archipelago. You will hear in a few moments that his research on Steinbeck began with an interest in modern reworkings of the epic, which is no surprise given those particular reading choices. I don't want to scoop Carter's presentation, but I do want to highlight why it impresses me. During Surrey last summer, he uncovered some important intellectual influences on Steinbeck's East of Eden, influences that have received very little scholarly attention. His thesis fills a real gap in the secondary literature in this regard. In the fall, Carter will have a chance to continue his development as a scholar and a critic and a writer when he begins graduate studies at Virginia Tech. I'm sure he will represent the Institute very well there. Without further ado, Carter Johnson.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really thankful for you all taking the time to be here this afternoon. I know all the cadets and the BRs are ready to leave. It's Friday. We're excited to head off to spring furlough. I also think the faculty who are here, it means a lot for you all to come to this, and I appreciate your support and the roles that you've played in getting me here. I also want to take time to thank Wes Stillwagon and Dr. William Ray, 2 Steinbeck scholars who really welcomed me into the community. And I'll actually be staying with Dr. Ray next week in California when we continue all this research at the National Steinbeck Center and also the Steinbeck Research Center at San Jose. So looking forward to that as well. And special thanks, of course, to Major Nepper. This project wouldn't be half what it is without him. And his support and guidance in this has been invaluable. So this morning, I really want to kind of tell a story. And here is East of Eden, first edition, and I want to kind of work through how this project began and then kind of the core element of what our project ended up being. So my interest in Steinbeck began in high school. I read Of Mice and Men and was really moved by the complexity that Steinbeck was able to accomplish. His stories aren't black and white, they're not easily distinguishing right and wrong, but they live in the nuance, and this was something new to me. This challenged my idea of literature, it challenged my idea of life. It had a deep impact on who I was as a person and also who I was as an academic. I put Steinbeck off for a little while, reading the other modernists. I go through reading Hemingway, I go through reading Fitzgerald, and Steinbeck kind of takes a back burner until, as Major Nepper mentioned, my first year at VMI, I worked through East of Eden. And this was unlike any other book that I've read. It is huge and it is a tome, but Steinbeck called it his only book. And this struck me as really peculiar. You always hear Steinbeck talk in regards to the Grapes of Wrath, but this all usually takes a secondary position. But he said that everything that I've written before this book, including the Grapes of Wrath, is only practice. And I said, well, if Steinbeck thinks the Grapes of Wrath is practice, then what is this book? So we dove into what East of Eden was, and as I read it, I began thinking, let's spend a summer and do a Surrey project. So the Surrey projects are a summer undergraduate research institute here at VMI. So Major Nepper and I, dressed in our civilian clothes, hanging out here, started working through East of Eden. And the idea, what we wanted to accomplish with our Surrey was kind of threefold. First, we wanted to see about Steinbeck's use of free will and how that relates to a deterministic worldview and also how it relates to existentialism. Secondly, we wanted to look at how East of Eden functions as an epic. So it is a massive novel, and it really mirrors biblical ideas, biblical allegory, and this aspect of it was, how does this compare to ancient epics as such a long, multi-generational story, and also how does it compare to other modernist epics? So things like James Joyce's Ulysses, which I did not finish, by the way, so that's still on the to-do list. And also T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. So these kind of two really cornerstone modernist pieces that I wanted to see, okay, they're up to something. They're up to these ideas of mythology, and they're specifically relating it to the idea of the epic. So that's the second thing we wanted to do. And then thirdly, I really personally wanted to help the little that I can revigorate the Steinbeck scholarship. I think oftentimes he's pigeonholed as a political writer, and certainly he is. Grapes of Wrath is a major political piece within the mid-20th century, and has got massive implications. But oftentimes, Steinbeck's philosophical interests, and specifically, as we'll talk about today, his psychological interests, are less frequently taught, and he's really kind of put aside as a popular writer. So we wanted to bring that reputation back along with these other ideas of exploration. Well, we accomplished that to a degree, but the project really took a different turn. And this happened as we were reading about the epic form and reading about how different epics have been done throughout history. We came across this guy. This is Joseph Campbell, the 20th century mythologist and author of A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And specifically, we discovered the idea of monomyth. And what the monomyth is it's Campbell's idea that all narratives are derivative from a single primary narrative. So this is the idea that any plot that you encounter is in some way related to a master plot, the monomyth. So what Campbell does is he sets that up as a progression, the hero's journey. He says a hero ventures forth from the world, common day, into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. So think about this framework in regards to epic narratives, mythology. Think about it in regards to modern cinema. Think about Lord of the Rings, Narnia, and you can start to see how this framework could have some substantial impact on how we interpret literature. So in regards to East of Eden, I immediately, when I read about the monomyth, thought about this is what Steinbeck is up to. Maybe there's a relation here. Steinbeck is talking about, at fundamental level, East of Eden is an allegory for the Cain and Abel narrative in Genesis 3. So this is something that we see throughout the Bible and throughout different mythologies across the world, is this idea of familial conflict or fraternal conflict. So I'm like, well, maybe the monomyth in some ways is what's going on here. So again, Campbell's talking about how all plots are derivative of a single mythic structure. Another figure that was related to Joseph Campbell is this man, Carl Jung. Jung was a 20th century psychoanalytic who was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud as well as Alfred Adler. He's famous for his work on the idea of the collective unconscious and also as on his ideas about the shadow. And both of those really play into the project as a whole. So as we were reading about Campbell, we stumbled upon Carl Jung. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit this morning about his idea of the collective unconscious. So Jung writes that the hypothesis of the collective unconscious is no more daring than to assume that there are instincts. And basically, this is, in a way, a justification of what Campbell is imposing on literature. How do we create myth? That's central to what Jung tried to explain. He
says there's a metaphorical substrate, so to speak, something below all of human experience, a common storytelling. And this would be the collective shared knowledge of some unconscious that is projecting into our narratives, into our stories through archetypes. And of course, this is a biological thing for Jung, but you can't really test a collective unconscious. But this is a big deal within scholarship about Jung. So in regards to Campbell, this was the way in which the monomyth is supported. Additionally, through reading with the collective unconscious, we came to a bigger idea that's going to play a specific role in the explanation of my work later on, and that's Carl Jung's idea of the shadow. He writes, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow. The shadow for Jung is very similar to the id in Freud. It's very similar to the Dionysian in Nietzsche. It's this idea of aggression, this idea of primal influences, this idea of raw striving towards vitality. It's not necessarily evil for Jung. He makes that distinction for sure, but it needs to have some sort of limiting factor. So for Freud, you can think about the ego limiting the id, and for Nietzsche, you can think about the Apollonian limiting the Dionysian. So in a similar way, Jung thinks that you can't allow the shadow to overcome you. You've got to have some way to bring it into your conscience and deal with those darker parts of your personality. Well, these were interesting ideas. They were somewhat abstract. We came across them in reading, and it's one thing to take something and apply it to a novel, to apply it to some sort of piece of literature. We could do that, and I think it's very compelling. When I read about these terms, I immediately went back to East of Eden. But when this project really started gaining strength, and we really started sinking our teeth in, was when we found really, you'll see in a minute, compelling biographic information that linked not only Jung to Steinbeck, but also Campbell to Steinbeck. This begins, and here's a picture of John in his mid-30s. It begins with a friendship in Monterey, California, between John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts. Ed Ricketts owned a biology lab in Cannery Row, and he's famously canonized in Steinbeck's Cannery Row novel. And what happened is these men immediately had this kind of strange friendship. Steinbeck would go to the tide pools off the coast and help Ricketts collect species, collect specimens, and bring them back to the lab. What Ricketts did was he then sold these specimens to different colleges, different high schools for experimentation. But the big aspect was that Ricketts owned a lab, and this lab, it kind of composed the intellectual hub of Monterey. So if you think about a similar time period in Paris, with this dynamic bohemian lifestyle, intellectual environment happening around these bars and these cafes, this is very similar to what's happening in Monterey. Ed Ricketts' lab became a hub for parties, for intellectual thought, for book reviews, for dances, and for cataloging species. It was this strange friendship that really kind of defies interest. But Ed was not only a part of the community, but he was a distinct part of Steinbeck's life. Well, it turns out in 1932, the two were visited by none other than Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell spent time with both of them in Monterey, and Carol Steinbeck, Steinbeck's first wife at the time, noted that John picked up a lot from Campbell. So not only is this idea of monomyth related immediately through the abstract, but now we see that Campbell had spent time with Steinbeck and Ricketts in Monterey. This continues on even more compellingly. The essays of Jung were among the many books discussed in the lab. This is a picture of the lab in Monterey. So now we've got Campbell, Steinbeck, and Ed Ricketts all discussing Jung in the lab. And this was something that it almost snuck up on us. I remember Major Nepper said, I'm sure Steinbeck read Campbell, I'm sure he read Jung, maybe just Google search it. And that's how this really began, and it comes out that we've got this really rich, compelling biographic link between Jung, Campbell, and Steinbeck. And this is, again, a picture of the lab. I hope to visit that next week and get some new pictures and see what that's all about there. So now we're kind of going to take a shift. So now that's kind of the background that we've established about these are the biographic book, it's a tome, and it covers several generations. But what we focused on was specifically the second half of the book. So we'll go through a bit of a plot outline here. Fundamentally, it's about two different brothers. You've got Aaron, who's charismatic, who people enjoy being around. He's got some sort of magnetism with people. He's generally well-liked, and he's distinctly his father's favorite. You also have his brother, Cal, played by the brooding James Dean in the 1955 movie. And he's exactly that. He's unsure of himself, and he's battling with ideas of who he is. And not only who he is, but specifically his propensity for evil. The brothers have a decent relationship. However, it seems as if Cal is always in the shadow of Aaron. And if we return to the idea of the biblical allegory, quite clearly you've got Aaron, the Abel figure, and Cal, the Cain figure here. This allegory continues with their father, Adam Trask. Adam, father of Cain and Abel. So we continue with this, that Adam he's a very dynamic figure within the novel. He's very temperamental, he's weak in some aspects, he's hopeless in other aspects, and he's got this great energy in different parts of the novel. He's really all over the spectrum. But specifically, the important part is that he favors Aaron. He favors him distinctly. The third portion of this equation is their mother, Kathy Ames, who Steinbeck describes as monsters born in the world to human parents. He's definitely heavy-handed in his treatment of Kathy Ames, who's later known as Kate within the novel. She represents almost, in a way, the embodiment of the shadow. She represents something that's dark and that's inhuman. In regards to plot, Adam finds her desperate and beat up, and he takes her in, and she really uses Adam. They move out west, and then she ends up having both of his sons, and then shooting Adam and running off into town. In town, she starts a brothel, and this brothel is distinctly known for its violence and degradation of humanity. It's specifically dark, and there's really no room for light within Steinbeck's handling of the Kate figure. So these are the really big major players within the novel. And one of the turning points later in the book is when Cal faces his mother. And when he comes to this, he's really struggling with who he is, and he comes to find out, and they had thought for their entire lives that their mother's dead, they were just babies when she shot Adam. Well, he finds out who his mother is. And this has a distinct impact on how he views the world. He goes through this conversation, and eventually he says, I don't have to be you. And this is defiant, and this is defined who Steinbeck paints as this evil embodiment of evil. So if we move on with the plot throughout the back half of the book, Adam Trask loses a great deal of money on an investment, and in order to try to earn his father's favor, Cal goes out, makes some shrewd investments, and then is able to earn back the money that his father lost. On his birthday, he comes to his father and says, here's the money you lost. And his father looks at him, and instead of accepting it, he says, give it back. I don't want money that's made off of the war. And this has a crushing effect to Cal. Adam tells him, why can't you give me what your brother, Aaron, has given me? He's given me a good life. He's gone to college. Why can't you give me that? And this is a crushing blow. And James Dean depicts it really well if you have time to watch the movie. This shatters really his world, and he falls into this deep despair, and he grabs his brother, who didn't know who his mother was, and brings him and forces him to confront her. Aaron handles this a lot differently, which we'll discuss later on, and is really destroyed and joins the war and is killed. At this point, Cal falls into despondency, he falls into despair, until eventually his father almost releases him from this by saying the word timshul. Timshul is a Hebrew word that Steinbeck translates as thou mayest. It's from the Genesis narrative, and it's really central to what Steinbeck does with free will and agency. So now we need to move, we've got this plot overview, and I want to start to say, okay, we've got the plot, now what does Young have to do with this at all? And really we want to remind of what we previously talked about, with the shadow, the concept of this consciousness and the shadow parts of humanity. So if we look at the characters specifically, Cal represents someone who recognizes his shadow. He recognizes it early. He sees that there's something in me that's got a propensity for evil. And when he faces his mother, he's able to say, I don't have to be you. Although he goes and actually ends up indirectly killing his brother, he still found some way to balance his shadow and his consciousness by the end of the book. In another fashion, Aaron never acknowledges his shadow. He's always seen in the novel and portrayed, although he's liked, he's self-righteous. He thinks that he's purely innocent. And his refusal to even acknowledge that his mother could be anything but a saint ends up being the exact thing that destroys him in the end. And this is something that's not foreign to Jung. Jung wrote that when you suppress the shadow, like Aaron did, and you don't acknowledge that there's something in you that has got the propensity and the potential for danger and harm, then the shadow grows denser and it grows blacker. So this is a very Jungian idea and how both of these brothers are reacting to the shadow. I want to read to you an excerpt from the thesis that really goes into slightly more detail about the relationship that Cal and Aaron have with the shadow. Also, it talks about Abra, who is originally Aaron's girlfriend, but ends up finally entering a relationship with Cal by the end of the novel. In a Jungian manner, Cal acknowledges his shadow and moves towards a balance. He recognizes his darkness, pulls it into the light, and subdues it with Timshul. Timshul again, free will. Abra joins Cal in this realization. In fact, she seems to reconcile her shadow before Cal does. And in sincere conversation with Lee, who is the housekeeper, Abra says, lately, I've never felt good enough. I've always wanted to explain to him, Aaron, that I was not good. Lee replies, and now that you don't have to be perfect, you can be good. Abra internalizes this idea. She recognizes her shadow qualities while simultaneously embracing her ability to choose the good. With Lee's nudging, she drags her shadow into her consciousness and avoids the pitfall of Aaron's ignorance and Cal's despondency. This is instrumental in Cal's life. Abra helps pull them from the abyss of self-loathing. They mature together. In many ways, their fight with the shadow is a coming-of-age culmination within the novel. They move from a cold to an intimate relationship. Only after they've set their own houses in order can they enjoy a sincere and harmonious relationship with each other. They must conquer the conflict within before turning to the chaos without. Conversely, Aaron never achieves this realization of a shadow. Although his archetype symbolizes the innocent and the good, Steinbeck creates him with the same tendency for destruction. Yet it's a destruction of a different kind. Aaron fails to recognize his shadow, displayed in his alienation of Abra for the priesthood. Abra tells Cal he couldn't stand to know about his mother because that's not how he wanted the story to go. He wouldn't have any other story, so he tore up the world. It's the same way he tore me up when he wanted to be a priest. Aaron is blind to his shadow. He never acknowledges his capacity for wickedness. Thus, he unknowingly becomes selfish and cruel. He represses any evil or brokenness, hiding his eyes from reality. Aaron is not prepared to withstand Kate's onslaught because he lacks a fundamental perception of the shadow. He maintains a self-righteousness which justifies his own goodness and forces the world into a disillusioned paradigm. He creates an artificial world. However, this artificial kingdom cannot stand. As Jung wrote, the shadow grows darker and blacker when repressed. And so it does for Aaron. He rejects the remedy that allows Cal to tell Kate, I don't have to be you. He rejects Timshul, free will, because he does not understand his need. Although Timshul is available to him, Aaron is blinded by his own imagined infallibility. He creates a glass world that cannot resist evil. Aaron's paradigm is crushed when he encounters Kate. So here we see clearly that this biographic connection between Campbell, between Jung, is in the novel. This is a lens in which this novel can be read. More than that, I believe that it's an influence on how the novel was written. And to return, so we've got the Jungian aspect, to return to Campbell's Monomyth, Steinbeck writes within the novel, I believe that there's one story in the world, and only one. Humans are caught in the net of good and evil. There is no other story. This is Steinbeck's Monomyth. It's not specifically the process that Campbell lays out, but rather it's a Jungian interpretation of humanity that allows for the shadow to be present and also the conscious to be present. He creates a monomyth that is really about human struggle between the ideas of the good and evil. This is the tension that Steinbeck creates in all of his novels, and specifically what the monomyth is that he creates in East of Eden. For Steinbeck, our first heritage is not Adam and Eve. It's after the fall. Cain and Abel are our heritage. He recognizes that our actions are not final, but we must defy the shadow that wants to overcome the individual. So in that way, Steinbeck creates his own monomyth, a monomyth of humanity caught in this net, a monomyth that imbues the individual with potential and the ability to overcome, a monomyth that does not end with failure.